working on 2007 Ford Fusion SE today, and the owner was complaining about a loud noise, kind of a squeaking noise during braking. So the first thing I did was I pulled the wheels off to inspect to see what was going on. Obviously my first suspicion was brake pads, but the only way you can confirm is to just pull the wheels off and check. So when I pulled the wheels off, the fronts didn't look too bad. There's still a little bit of braking material there left. But when I got to the back was basically gone. In some of the pads, the owner was almost right down to the back plate. These are the original rotors. I did this brake job on this car for the owner maybe about 4 years ago, and the rotors were pretty new looking back then, so there's a little bit of a ridge here, a little bit of gouging here. You know, there's a little bit of life left in these rotors, but when I got to the back rotors are even worse. Obviously, if they were being pressed against by the backing plate here, the backs are really gouged a lot more and they're in rough shape. So we're going to replace the back rotors as well. So we might as well just do the front when we're at it. So how I got to this stage was basically just removing these two bolts here that hold on the caliper, and these bolts go into slide pins. That's what I call them, and they allow the caliper to move along the move in this direction on the rotor. If these are seized, which these have really good motion, but if these are seized, you have to get those out of there and get them greased up or replaced, because if you don't, what will happen is the caliper won't sit on the rotor flush, and what will happen is you will overheat your brakes immediately. Trust me, don't ask me how I know. At this point where I was at, I just removed these two bolts out of those glide pins, and then I just pried the caliper off, and then the brake pad just popped right off. So now we have to compress the caliper piston back in, because the old pads have shrunk so much that whenever we put the new pads in here, we're not going to be able to fit the caliper back over the pads when it's in this position. So before we can get the caliper back over the new pads, we'll have to compress this piston. And so to do that, the easiest thing to do is to pop the hood, take the cap off the brake fluid reservoir, and we're just going to use a C-clamp to slowly push that in. So now what's next is there's two bolts behind here, and those two bolts just hold this caliper bracket on, and so when I take those two nuts off, I'll be able to take the rotor off. So I've already I already sprayed them with some penetrating fluid. So they should, and I also anti-seized these nuts and bolts 3 years ago. So there should be no issues with these things coming out. See that? Still lots of anti-seize on there from 3 years or 4 years ago. So if you guys work on cars, put anti-seize on it, on all your nuts and bolts when you reassemble. It'll make your life a lot easier down the road. Okay, so now this caliper bracket just comes right off. So now we're just pulling off the old hardware. There we go. Okay, some nice fresh grease on the pins here. Okay. Slide that back on. Rubber boots back on. Perfect. Now the rotor should come off. Okay, still having problems getting this rotor off. I did some reading online, and apparently, unlike my other vehicles that I've worked on, like that have a little threaded spot in the rotor to help push the rotor off, these actually, the threaded portion is actually on the wheel hub and not on the rotor at all. So those holes there are actually for pushing a rotor off, but they're actually apparently like these little Torx bolts that are there to hold the rotor on, probably to help assembly or something like that down the assembly line. But anyway, they're not there, so I suppose that the only reason this isn't, it's free, the only reason I can think of it's not coming off is there's a ring of rust back here on the hub that's holding somewhere along the hub there that's holding the rotor on place. So I'm gonna give it a squirt with WD-40 or some penetrating oil, and then I'm gonna rotate it, hit it with a hammer, rotate it, hit it with the hammer. Should pop off. I need a bigger hammer. There we go. Okay, so nice surprise was that the new brakes didn't come with new hardware. So I'm reusing the old hardware, which isn't ideal, but whatever, it's better than nothing. So I had to take the caliper bracket back off and install this. Okay, now that we got the old hardware on, we can reinstall these bolts, reinstall the caliper bracket. These bolts have to be very tight. On some of my Jeeps, the recommended torque specs are like 90 foot-pounds or something like that. I'm not sure. I can't find it anywhere for what the Ford Fusion torque specs are on this, but all I know is it has to be super tight. So I'm just going to lube a couple of places on the caliper bracket where the brake pads sit, and this will allow the sometimes on new brakes, what'll happen is you'll hear like almost like a squeaking noise or something when you're coming to a stop, when you're almost at a stop, and that's usually these little brake pads are rattling and causing a little bit of vibration, and that's causing that squeaking noise. And so I always put a little bit of grease in here where the brake pads sit. Now be careful, don't get any on the rotor. Obviously you don't want any on the braking surface. Unfortunately, I would recommend using brake grease, but these brake pads didn't come with brake grease either. So okay, so those fit pretty good. Well, those old hardware pieces still have lots of spring left in them. They're nice and tight in there. So the other place we're going to grease is on the backs of the brake pad, and that will stop a lot of the squeaking as well. It doesn't take lots. Again, use the brake grease that I highly recommend brake grease, but I don't have any, and none came with my kit. So I should have it. I should have some handy, but I don't. Okay. Now, if you're having a hard time getting your caliper back on, probably means you didn't compress your piston, retract your piston enough, or maybe your pads are misaligned, aren't seated properly. Anyway, that went on really easy. So. Now, just get one of these bolts started. Once you get one started, the other one's easy. So what I found online was that these bolts are to be torqued to 20 foot-pounds, which is 240 inch-pounds. Doesn't seem like a lot. So now it's just time to pop the wheel on, and then we'll go to the back. Okay, similar to the front, took these two bolts out, which connect the caliper to your caliper bracket and slide pins. As you can see, similar to the front, my slide pins are still moving quite well. And as I mentioned earlier, when we pulled the back brakes, the back pads were basically down to nothing. And as you can see, there's a lot more gouging and a lot more of the rotor material is gone on the back here. Okay, so the backs are a little trickier. In that the bolts holding the caliper bracket are a little bit harder to get to. So this one isn't so bad. This top one's pretty accessible. But the control arm is kind of interfering with this one. So conveniently, Ford has put a hole through the control arm so you can get an actual socket on this bolt down here. And so with an extended socket like this, you can reach through and get on that nut right there. So we're just going to do the top one first. Now we're going to do that bottom one with the extended socket. Again. So now, the only way to get the bolt out is to pull it through that hole in the control arm, as I mentioned. Okay. Like that. So now, this should come right off. And we might as well leave this hardware on here because we know that we need it again. Get that out of the road. I suspect I'm going to have to use the BFH again. Oh, sweet. Okay, so the back calipers are a little bit different than the front, and how you're supposed to retract them is see these little grooves in the piston. Well, that is for a special tool like this, for example. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to rotate the piston while putting downward pressure on it, like that. Okay, well, I remember last time I did these brake jobs, these back calipers gave me a real hell of a time. And sure enough, they are, again this time, even worse. Anyway, so what I did was I disassembled the brakes and took the rotor off, and I just put the caliper bracket back in the holes. And I'm just going to put the kind of mount the caliper in place right there. And what that's going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to put a lot of torque on this, because what's happening right now is I'm turning this with a ratchet, this tool with a ratchet, and I just can't, with my fingers or with with some vice grips or anything, I'm not able to hold the caliper with enough torque in order to rotate this. It's just so stiff. It's just solid in there, and I've even sprayed a bit of lube in there, but it's not helping. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and bolt it to the caliper bracket here, like that. And then I'll be able, without the rotor in place, I'll be able to get my tool in place, and I'll be able to put as much torque as I can. Anyway, we're going to try this. The last thing I'm going to try is I'm going to take the whole caliper off and take it to the workbench with a vise. Anyway, here goes nothing. Now I can apply lots of torque. It's just, oh. Nope, the pins just slide right through. I'll fix that with a clamp. Okay, so now we have a clamp on here. That's just holding the caliper, keeping the caliper from sliding out. Let's try this again. So I'm trying to put a lot of forward pressure on it as well. And believe it or not, it's turning. So that's good. It's just, I don't want to strip them. Okay, this is working good. So, that's actually turning. Okay, So here, this is a perfect trick for those of you who just have this cheap little tool and you're having problems retracting. Bolt it back onto your caliper bracket, put a clamp on here. Seems to work pretty good. Okay, similar to the fronts, we gave these rotors some brake clean, and we're not going to touch the rotor surface with our clean hands. I added some fresh grease to the pins. Again, these bolts that mount the caliper bracket have to be really tight. So similar to the front. Just gonna add a little bit of grease to some of the places where the brake pads are gonna move.